Jonathan Conricus, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
You've been in Australia now for over a week. Unfortunately, this beautiful country of mine, has been in the headlines in the context of this war, this post-October 7 paradigm. There's been a well-documented explosion of anti-Semitism that's occurred gradually in this country ever since the events of October 7. Can you give us an idea as to how you felt when you landed here? You've been here for a little while. You've walked around the streets of Melbourne, Canberra, and Sydney. How does it feel to be an Israeli in Australia today?
Feels great. Happy to be here. I share your love for your country. I mean, it is beautiful. And when you read a bit of history and you think of the short history that Australia has, from where it started, where it is today, it's a beautiful success story. And I really cherish, I love success stories. I love to see people work through hardship and achieve their goals. And I think looking at Australian society today, by and large, we'll discuss anti-Semitism, which I think is a bellwether sign for bad things happening in society. But if we put that aside for a second, I look at Australia and I'm very happy for you guys. Your forefathers have worked hard and you've built a beautiful society that works.
Yeah.
That is very inclusive, that is tolerant, that is peaceful, that is friendly to the environment and friendly to people, and where people are respected for who they are, and that's a great thing.
And I think the embodiment of that beauty is that there's been a very strong connection between Israeli people and the Australian public and Australians, not just Jewish Australians, but Australians in general. And I guess that the Jewish Australians are...
And I think Australia has a very good image
in the
world, right? You have a reputation of being a sound and healthy country. You don't get too mixed up in politics, healthy lifestyles, and a general positive outlook on life.
And now our Australian Jewish community has proudly participated in the success story of this nation. We had Sir Isaac Isaacs was the first Australian-born Governor-General. Then we had, another Governor-General, Sir Selman Cowen, who's known as the Great Healer of Australia. Many army officers, many jurists, many philanthropists. Australian Jewry is so integrated into that success story that you talk about. I guess that makes the impact of this explosion of anti-Semitism even more difficult to swallow.
It makes it more absurd for me as an outsider to try to wrap my head around it. Because when you look at it, and just look at the history, and you look at the many chapters that Jews in Australia have written in the Australian Book of Success, then you ask yourself, why are Jews afraid? Why are Jews being bullied? Why is that tolerated by other Australians who have, in many cases, benefited from the success that Jews have generated and worked through and achieved? And that is odd, but it's odd, but we're not naive. We've seen it in the past in history. We've seen cultures and societies that allegedly promoted strong, egalitarian and progressive and positive values become weak and corrupted from the inside. And many times what we've seen in history is that the first public indicative that you can't really deny is anti-Semitism. And the hate is channeled towards Jews. Why? It's easy, they're identifiable, they're usually successful, and they're usually not militant, and they shy away from conflict. And I think that really describes the Australian Jewish community, beautiful community, hardworking, honest, patriotic Australian citizens who do well for their country. They do well, they have good intentions, they're loyal, they're happy to live here. They don't take life in Australia with its freedoms and liberties for granted because their forefathers came from other places, many Holocaust survivors, and they know what it is to appreciate freedom and democracy. Yet that is the sad situation that we're in. That Jews are being targeted, that this artificial line that for many years was tolerated in the West, that there's anti-Israelism and criticism of Israel, and then there's anti-Semitism. I think we can lay that to rest in Australia, and I think that those two evils are actually one and the same. If anybody would approach me and say that I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm just, anti-Zionist, and I don't agree with Israel's policies. And then you start asking a few more questions, and you peel away a few layers of the onion. You ask the bottom line question of, do you believe that we, the Jews, have a right to our ancestral homeland in Israel, to live prosperously, safely in that homeland? And usually, if you're able to rattle that person enough and get an honest answer, you'll get the answer no.
So I guess it's very common to understand the canary in the coal mine analogy, right?
Yeah.
That they come after the Jew first, but it's a symptom of a worse toxin inside society, that the Jews are the first, but then they'll come after others afterwards. But so we in Australia are acutely aware of that. But I want to zoom out on that analogy to a more global scale. So is this is the anti-Semitism in Australia an example of the problems maybe within Western civilization, with its connection with Israel and its connection with Jews? Thus, the canary in the coal mine is indeed Australia on a more global level as opposed to a micro level here.
On the global scale, and I say this as someone who grew up in Sweden, born in Israel, but I grew up in Sweden. And I think Sweden and Australia, they share quite a lot of things, successful societies that are based, on their flags. You have values like democracy, liberty, and civil rights and humanistic approach. And in many ways, those are beautiful things. Sweden doesn't have the beautiful weather that Australia has, and that influences the people and the climate. But I think there are many commonalities. And if I zoom out on Western culture in general, what I regret very much as an Israeli is that for some odd reason, very strong societal trends have been shaped and gained strength over the last 20, 30 years, where strong forces of the support of minorities, the propulsion forward of people that are not white, and the focus on various types of genders and gender identities and the environment, all in themselves good causes that, if detached from Israel, I would see great. Yes, the historical wrongs have been made against lots of people. Let's rectify that, and let's move forward with various populations around the world, including in Australia and in Canada and in other places, in Sweden as well, by the way, in the north, the Sami.
So you're talking about intersectionality of the progressive leftist causes.
Exactly. And then what is absurd is that I think it was something that was planned all along. When those movements started to form, they understood that Zionism and the self-definition, the success story of a religious minority, which, by the way, should be applauded by people who support indigenous claims to territory, that's the Jews. That is what the Jewish story is, Israeli story is, an indigenous people and that formed a political movement and was successful, unlike others who were not successful and spend their time crying about it and lamenting it and asking for pity and condolences and stipends and casinos and whatever rights people want and economic benefits. Jews didn't do that. They got organized, they worked for it, they fought for it, and now Zionism is a success story of a small indigenous minority in a very hostile area. And as such, is being punished by the same intellectual deep currents that allegedly are supposed to support the thing that the Jews were able to achieve. And if I draw, many comparisons, I find that is the big macro picture where Israel and Zionism finds itself on the wrong side of that barrier, where everything woke, liberal, progressive, and allegedly advanced, for some reason, sees Israel and Zionism as a wrong and as an evil, which it isn't. And I think that's the biggest perversion that we're talking about, the deep current of it. And then that connects with, strong societal moves in the US with Black Lives Matter, with LGBTQ, even though it's absurd. Israel is a very tolerant society and country. I think it is the most tolerant in the Middle East by many margins. It is the only country where gay and lesbian and trans people can walk the streets safely without being harassed or attacked in the Middle East. It's where their rights are enshrined in law, yet these movements in the US and in many parts of Western Europe, and maybe here in Australia as well, they are supporters of Palestinians, and they are supporters of Islamist organizations whom, at their core belief, really would deny these people with different sexual orientation basic humanity. In many of those societies, in many Arab societies, it is a punishable offense to have a different sexual orientation. In Israel, it isn't. And the fact that we even have to explain it, and we even have to showcase how benign and progressive we are, is absurd. I mean, I think it's, someone holding a sign of Queers for Palestine is absurdity at its peak. If you're a queer for Palestine, please go and live there. Go live there and be openly gay, be openly trans, or whatever it is that you are, and see how well that will work out for you. You will see the ugly face of Arab Islamism, of fundamentalism, and you'll see how little tolerance they have for anything that is different from them. And so it won't end well.
So I guess that intersectionality explains the motivations of the citizenry, of civil society. But does that bleed into the political echelon? So we spent a day in Canberra together. You had meetings with members of parliament, with elements of the bureaucracy, and it's all well documented as let's just say, the departure from a long-standing, warm and very strong bipartisan position on Israel that has been, let's just say, not as supportive as what we had hoped historically over the past 2.5 years of this current federal government, specifically in the Australian government's position vis-a-vis the conflict in Gaza. So within the context of that bilateral relationship, is there some type of explanation that extends from the citizenry and civil society into the political class, and is that some type of justification to what we're experiencing here between in the bilateral relationship between Israel and Australia?
I think that's always an ongoing process between politicians who have to have an acute listening, and they have to listen to what their constituents feel, say, think, believe, are angry about, or happy about, and what they hope for. And as such, Australian politicians perhaps have been paying too much attention to various radical ideologies that have taken hold and root in Western society, which basically are about hating their own culture. I see it as people that live in free societies based on Judeo-Christian values that were formed through hard work, through wars, through fighting, and eventually through success, and then economic entrepreneurship. Western societies that we live in today, the very few democracies that exist in the world, I think some of them suffer sincerely from self-hatred, self-loathing, which I don't think really has a place. I'm all for introspection and looking at yourself and atonement and thinking, what did I do right wrong at the personal level and as a collective? That's great. But there's a fine line between thinking about your mistakes and trying to be a better person and to be a better entity, and constantly flogging yourself for being born in a free, successful society and enjoying the liberties of what happened before.
So there has been some global pushback electorally on that.
Lots of it.
Do you see that and so you think more's coming, and that is the course correction? Does it overcorrect, or does it go back to a more happy medium?
Well, let's hope for a medium. Let's hope for sanity. Just like I'm confident, and I've been traveling around the world for the last year and a half, met lots and lots of people, middle of the road in America, their Main Street, I don't know the Australian equivalents, but ordinary good people who want to live their lives, they want to provide for their families, they want to be happy and lead comfortable lives, but they also want meaning in life, and they have things that they believe in and things that they don't agree with. What disturbs me is, and this is an age-old historical phenomenon, is that usually these people don't get mixed up in issues before they're a little bit too big and too late and too severe. And I feel that to be the case in Australia as well. I believe and I'm convinced that most Australians, regardless of their background and religious affinity, they support Israel. They see Israel as a good thing. They see Israel as a success story, as a miracle, that was able to fight its way into existence, and it's holding on to a little tiny sliver of land, and it is the homeland of the Jewish people. I think that's what most Australians would think. Where I think it is unfortunate is that there appears to me to be a bit of complacency towards and too much tolerance towards extremist views in Australia. And that I think is regrettable from two reasons. One, because it isn't fair. It isn't fair towards Australian Jews to be singled out, to be harassed, to be intimidated. It isn't fair, and other Australians, I think, should do more in order to take a stand and say, no, this isn't what we stand for. This isn't Australia. Australia is a beacon of freedom, of fairness, of politeness, of being respectful to your neighbor, and being accommodating and positive. That, in my mind, is what Australia is about. That and fierce competitors in sports and many other things and the outdoors. But really, politically speaking, that's what I believe Australia to be. And as such, I would expect everyday Australians, and I would expect Muslims to do the same and say, listen, this isn't, I don't stand for this. I don't agree with it. I may not be a biggest fan of Israel and all of its policies, and sure, I have criticisms of our policies and government, like everyone has. But at the end of the day, if you boil it down, it is a democracy fighting for its survival against very dark and very evil ideologies, and it should be an easy choice. And for Australians, yes, it's far away on the other side of the world, and who cares? I can understand people. But in terms of how non-Jewish Australians look at this, and when they see these negative, hateful events happening, I would expect Australians to do a little bit more and have more moral clarity and say, well, no, this isn't what I stand for. This is un-Australian. The behavior of those two nurses at a
Basetown Hospital.
Basetown Hospital, that is un-Australian. That isn't what people around the world would think is normal and acceptable in Australia. And I think they should be made an example of. People in Australia, leaders, politicians, who say, this is very severe. We are going to take severe, significant action against them in order to make the point that this is absolutely unacceptable in Australian society, in our public health services, for anybody to espouse these kinds of hateful views towards anyone. If a Jew said it, I doubt he would say it, but if a Jew would say it, horrible, should be punished just the same way. It has no place, that kind of violence and abuse of power and hatred based on just the religion of someone. And I think that's lacking. What I've heard from Australian legislators isn't what I want to hear from them in terms of a moral standing. And if I go back to the 2 points, so yeah, one, the hatred towards Jews, it's unfair, and fellow Australians, not of the Jewish faith, I expect them to stand up and say, we're not okay with this. And two, I think that yes, on a global scale, and this has been said before, I think Israel, we can use an Americanism, we're the off-Broadway show, and the West is Broadway. Yes, we are the first ones, we're on the battle line here, and we face many of the challenges, the tactics of enemies, and the hatred, and the violence that is still far away from the West, but eventually it comes knocking on the Western doors as well. We saw attempts to blow up Australian aircraft by ISIS about 10 years ago, which Israel was instrumental in stopping by tipping off Australian security forces that there was a bomb on the plane, saved a few hundred lives. And we see that, suicide bombers and car rammings and stabbings, it may start in the Middle East, and the initial target may be Israel, but it doesn't stop there. And as such, I think that Western countries, Australia being one of them, even though Southeast, but West, democracy, liberal world, the world of order, should stand together. And we shouldn't be confused and poisoned by all kinds of ideologies and get confused about who we are, what's right and what's wrong.
So let's pivot to Washington now. So you're now a senior fellow at the Washington-based Foundation for Defense of Democracies. So you've lived in the United States. You get the United States. Obviously, the Trump factor is a big factor in what you've just said. The realignment of the world order, the impetus for that is going to come from the United States. Well, we'll all hope that it comes from the United States as opposed to other, hopeful superpowers. But where do you see And how do you see Trump doing that, firstly within Israel and regionally itself in the Middle East, but then more globally? Obviously, in Australia, we have an Indo-Pacific focus. We have as we should, and we are not out of the woods in terms of our geopolitical outlook for the next 5 to 10 years. But it all seemingly is interconnected with the regional issues with Iran specifically, which we will get to. There are connections with Russia and China. That connection has an impact with us. So in terms of that realignment, how do you see the next 3 to 4 years of the Trump presidency going, more regionally in the Middle East, but then zooming out more regionally as well?
Yeah, I barely understand my own country, Israel, so I don't think that I understand the US. Lived there for a while and read a lot and speak a lot and try to understand, but I really approach it from a position of extreme humility because it is a superpower and extremely complex. I'll say the following, that I think we are in interesting new times where maybe the US will go back to being the country that takes the dominating stance and seeks to reframe conversations, relationships, treaties, and situations with adversaries for the better of the US and for the better of democracy and world order. I believe that it is by far the best option for the world to have a strong United States that dominates and exerts its influence in a positive way in order for there to be a counterweight, a strong counterweight against the regressive forces of the world, the totalitarian regimes of China, of Russia, of various countries in South Africa, of course Iran and terrorist organizations. And the biggest and most important country that does that, without any comparison, is the US. And if we see more leadership and initiative from the US, I welcome that very much, and I think that probably is where we're going. I am concerned because I've been following events in Southeast Asia, and the people at FDD, we have excellent scholars that monitor China, the Communist Party, their policies, their plans, their military preparations, their military buildup, the production of both aircraft carriers, other types of hardware, and the sheer size of the Chinese armed forces. That is a concern. If we were located not in the Middle East, but in the so-called Chinese area of influence or sphere of influence, I would be concerned. And if I were a Taiwanese, I would be very, very concerned about the future. And I think in Australia, there's room for concern. Maybe not, an invasion of Australia, but definitely that type of bullying and forceful activity by a totalitarian regime. And we in Israel have a lot of experience with dealing with totalitarian regimes, none of them the size and capacity of China, but the mindset is familiar from many of our enemies.
So some would argue that President Trump is borderline, if not an isolationist, and wants to withdraw his forward deployment out of certain regions. Most importantly for us is northeast Syria. So the influence and leverage, obviously, in the first couple of months of his presidency is obviously there, in multiple theaters, whether that be Russia, Ukraine, or the Middle East, or elsewhere. It's there. But how does he balance that desire, or that noted desire of with withdrawing forces, when to arguably, apply that influence and that pressure to get that realignment of the global powers? He needs to be able to use, at times, not just economic levers, but also military levers as well. So how does he balance that?
I actually welcome that the US appears to be wanting to realign its activities abroad and its presence abroad along what serves American purposes best. I think that's what every country should be doing. Wars that are not properly planned and do not have clear and obtainable objectives are never a good idea. War is generally bad, but sometimes it's necessary. And wars that aren't clearly defined and you really know what you're doing and why you're doing it, that's never a good idea. And I think that the US has been involved in that kind of wars, and it hasn't been successful for the US, and it has perhaps caused people in the US not to want to continue to shoulder the responsibility of being the leader of the free world. So there's a distinction to be made. But when I look at US interest in the Middle East, in the region, I think that yes, the US biggest adversary is China, but I also think that China is monitoring the US carefully, and wherever it sees the US stepping back, it interprets that as a weakness, as a sign of lack of focus and conviction. And I think the Chinese will deduce from that they can get away with doing all kinds of hostile and negative activity in Southeast Asia. So while I understand and respect that America wants to focus on China, that's very important. Being weak is never a good thing. And I think that focusing assets without putting American troops in harm's way, but by supporting strong allies and helping allies defend themselves and defeat enemies. And there's a key distinction here, because for many years Israel received lots of material and political diplomatic support from the US, but we were always kept short of really defeating our enemies. If you look at the history of the Middle East, it's been, there were wars that we actually defeated our enemies and we forced them to surrender. And we got a political agreement at the end of the war that reflected the battlefield situation when the last bullet was fired, 48, 67, as an example. But since 73 and onwards, we've been able to defend ourselves, and we've gotten just enough support, but we've never been able to really crush and defeat an enemy. And that is why our enemies one of the reasons why they keep on rising and they keep on waging wars against us. We're seeing a similar thing here with Hamas. Hamas performed one of the most humiliating and bloody acts of terrorism in Israeli history against Israeli civilians. They opened a war against us, and for many months we were prevented from actually defeating that enemy by various means. And I hope that will change, and I think that it would be excellent for a pure utilitarian American point of view not to have assets and soldiers and people exposed, boots on the ground, but just to help allies fight and defeat and win. And then that will reflect very well on America's standing. The enemies of America will see that the US stands by, and it doesn't limit its allies from really winning wars, and it's really about winning at the end of the day. And that, I think, hopefully is a positive change that will happen, which will be, in my understanding, great for America. In Israel, it would be great, and I think it will be great for Saudi. It will be bad for the Islamic Republic of Iran and its expendable Arab proxies that they've been using over the last 20 years, and it will be good for prosperity.
So Australia's been, well, the United States is Australia's most important geostrategic partner and has been for forever. So in the context of the post-October 7 conflict in Israel, there had been times where the Australian government has been at odds with the US administration, including the Biden administration, but also, and will be, again at loggerheads with the Trump administration, most notably on UN votes in the General Assembly, but also its position on the ICJ and the ICC. Now, do you think that so we're coming up to an election shortly, so whoever is going to be the next Prime Minister of Australia, as we only have 3-year terms in Australia, will have President Trump as their US president for the entirety of that term. So how important is it to a president like Trump to have allies, strong allies like Australia, being on the same page with other things within that context of that realignment, which includes its very strong position on where things are heading inside Israel? What is there, and what would be the consequence from not, towing that line?
So I think if I read between the lines of the uppercase letters in the tweets, etc., what I understand is that President Trump expects his allies to step up and to actively participate in defending Western values, in defending freedom, prosperity, democracy. And he expects, of course, countries that benefit from US support in security assurances and trade agreements, etc., to step up and show that in action as well. And I think that's very healthy. He's demanding it of the Europeans. I haven't heard him speak about Australia, but I understand that it's at different levels of conversation. And I can speak about the Europeans. I think that's a very welcome development, like to demand of your friends and allies that let's share the burden. We US, we're the strongest and we'll lead. That's fine. We have the biggest financial and military capabilities, so we will take the lead and shoulder most of the responsibilities. But we need you other guys who are part of the same team to step up. And
so it goes against Australia's geostrategic outlook to pick fights on these issues related to Israel within the global forums instead of looking at the importance of the US position on that.
Yes, and I think, at the moral level, never mind politics.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, politics are very important, and we make decisions according to political benefit. But at the end of the day, I think it is really, to me, it's surprising and very disappointing to see a country like Australia vote almost consistently vote against Israel, sometimes abstaining from the most abhorrent votes and resolutions in the UN, but many times, unfortunately, voting against Israel. That is really a sad thing to see. And I think it's part of that story that has been told for so many years, that almost mythical theme that everything that's wrong in the Middle East is related to Israel, and if we can only force Israel into concessions, things will be all right. I had a personal experience with that. I was seconded to the UN, served at UN headquarters for 3 years as an Israeli officer in the IDF. I dealt with UN peacekeeping, and I had the dubious pleasure of being in the Security Council when they adopted Resolution 2234. At the end of Obama's term, his farewell signature moved towards, I think, the Israeli Prime Minister and the State of Israel, a complex UN Security Council resolution which has power. Which
proposed actually by New Zealand, where were one of the co-sponsors, so yeah.
Yes, and I think Egypt and Qatar were also very important in getting it through. And it basically says that the various areas in historical Israel, the land of Israel, which some call Palestine, are occupied territory, including, but not limited to, the Western Wall in Jerusalem, a place that has been holy for Jews ever since the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans. And that is declared occupied territory. Of course, the Golan, Judea and Samaria, other parts of Jerusalem, and it basically pinned a lot of the problems of the Middle East on Israel. Now, what I felt, I was in the room, and I remember all of the delegates voting in favor, yes, and then it came to the US, and Ambassador Samantha Powers abstained. The spontaneous applause that erupted in the room was deafening. It's a room that holds about 300-400 people, and it was fully packed. Great anticipation, because everybody had a sense that this was going to be either an American abstention or a support, and as such the resolution would pass. So people knew that this was coming. Everybody wanted to be in the room. People rose to their feet. They cheered. They shouted, pumping fists and clapping, and really as if they had solved world hunger, energy crisis, and saved global habitat of animals for eternity, and cured cancer. All of that in one resolution, which only chastised Israel and blamed a lot of what's going on in Israel. I think that mindset has too strong of a holding in Australia across the board, and I think that it is definitely time for there to be change in that aspect, and to really to take a fresh look on the Israeli-Arab conflict, and to understand that Israel is only defending itself. It is the successful movement of a small religious ethnic minority in the Middle East that, against all odds and against, 2,000 years of suffering, came back to his homeland, was able to do that, and to forge a country for its own. And that is not a punishable crime. That is an example for other ethnic minorities to try to do, not to be undermined and worked against. And I regret that this is the situation, but the optimist in me says we'll keep on fighting, and eventually freedom-loving countries and democracies will come around.
Well, hopefully you can keep that optimism for the final, but it's a big question. So let's move over to Israel now. We left the most important to last.
Yeah.
Now you've been on the record extensively, not just here in Australia, but elsewhere, on the details of what's happening on the day-to-day, the situation in Gaza, the hostage releases, the situation with Hezbollah in Syria. All of that is known as to what your position is. So I guess if I can ask you a more unique and different question to answer, it's more so on the strategic level, that at the cessation of this seven-front war that Israel's been fighting for the past 16 months, where to from here, both regionally, meaning geostrategically, Israel has been able to have successes in certain areas, but I want to pin it with where we are at with obviously the head of the snake, and that's the Iranian regime. Where do you see things in 6 months or 6 years' time within that paradigm? But then finally, hopefully your optimism extends to the Israeli people. And where do you see Israel as people and as a country in the short term, and then in the more intermediate long term?
So it'll sound simplistic, but for brevity. 6 months, Iran doesn't have an active nuclear military program. And in 6 years, hopefully the beautiful Iranian people, with its beautiful history, culture, and pride, is free of the tyrannical Islamist regime that has been oppressing the Iranian people for so long. That, I think, is the most important part. It won't happen by external interference or involvement. It will happen by the second part about the Iranian people. It will happen by the Iranian people being able to rise up against a corrupt, failing, mismanaging, and oppressive regime that has been oppressing, killing, torturing, executing, and doing horrible things to Iranians. Nothing related to Israel, just bad for Iranians. And I think their historical time is up. That evil historical regime will fall, and that the Iranians in Iran will rise up against it, and hopefully they will have help from powerful countries around the world with the economic, diplomatic, and military capacity to help. And I see that as one of the after effects, perhaps the most important one, of the Iranian-led assault on Israel on October the 7th. The backlash will be for the Islamic Republic, for that evil and oppressive regime, that the Iranian people will rise up against it.
So short-term, strike on the nuclear facilities, longer-term, regime change.
Yes. Freedom for the Iranian people against that horrible regime.
And just in a note, the regional outcome of that will be stability, regional prosperity.
Yeah, I mean, we can hope for stability and prosperity. History tells us that there's something in the water, in the air.
It's hot there. It's very hot there, Jonathan.
Yeah, it is hot, and history tells us that it's a bumpy path towards those benign situations. But we can hope and work towards it. And I think that by the way, we spoke about America before. There are great American plans of infrastructure, trade, and economic development that involve Saudi, the Emirates, Jordan, Israel, and other countries, Indonesia, and I know that you have very profound understanding of Indonesia and that area of the world, Malaysia as well. It could be good for so many millions of people, and hopefully focus on prosperity, on culture, on living life and pursuing, fulfillment and happiness, and not on these horrible wars that have plagued us for so long.
And for Am Yisrael?
And for Am Yisrael, we need different leadership. We need leadership that prioritizes our unity and our strength, not our divisions. We need, I think, a leadership that says the Zionist story and the miracle that has been created by Am Yisrael is a rare, and beautiful flower that must be protected and must be nurtured, and it must be nurtured by everyone. And that needs to change in Israel. I'm not afraid of external threats to the stability of the state of Israel. Yes, we have lots of enemies, and they're on full ugly display in the last 500 days. They will not really challenge the success of the Zionist endeavor. It can only, I think, be our own undoing. And what I think we should be focusing on is rewriting the social agreement and the entire ethos of what we're doing in Israel and who has rights and obligations as part of being living in the success story of the state of Israel. If you live in Israel, then you are part of the Zionist story, and if you are that, then there are contributions to be made. You are to be a loyal citizen of Israel. Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people, and that means everybody. It means rights and dignity and honor for everybody, whether they are Arab and Muslim and Christian and Jewish and Druze and Circassian and Bedouin and all of the other minorities that we have and respect in Israel. But it means that the dominant story is, this is the land, this is the country of Israel. That's one side. Second side, to my brothers and sisters of the Jewish faith who are not part of the story, they need to come home. They need to feel that they are part of the story, and they need to act in such a way that they are part of the story. And the success story of Israel won't be the same, and we won't be as strong, and we won't have the economy to support the military to defend ourselves if we don't have full participation, equal participation of everybody. So what needs to change, and I think this is already happening from bottom up, grassroots, Israelis, Haredim, ultra-Orthodox, secular, people understand that the only way forward is through unity, not a conformist unity, a unity that understands that there are differences and we respect other people's way of life, but there are some things that are above. National service and being loyal citizens to the state of Israel is above, should be above everything else. And I think that is where we need to go forward, and you can already see people voting with their feet and wanting to get out of social ghettos that they have been segregated into by political leadership, by people who benefit money and power from it, and they're trying to break free of that into a better Israeli society. I'm hopeful, and I think that will happen. I have great hopes for the future, for future Israeli generations. I think we will be in a strong Zionist, patriotic environment that promotes, is inclusive to others, respects others, but is very certain about its own standing in future. This is the state of Israel. It is ours by history, by act, by present, and in the future. You want to be part of the success story? Ahlan wa sahlan, you're welcome. But these are the terms. And for all of the Jews to serve in the military, for everybody to pull their fair share in the burdens that we need to in order to continue to provide for our country, that's how I educate my children, that's what I expect others to do. And that, I think, with good, solid, real, virtuous leadership is where the state of Israel will be, and I'm hopeful for it. It will be a home for Jews from around the world. It'll be a place where all of the Jews around the world can feel home and will be welcomed. I hope that we will have more religious tolerance towards other parts of Judaism, other interpretations of Judaism, and that the horrors of October 7, that I think you spoke about, and very correctly, about the anti-Semitism, what it has also, I think, kicked off is, and a chain effect is, that Jews today are more connected to our heritage, to our religion, and are getting back to our roots. And that's an excellent thing. I very much welcome that, and that's super important that Jews around the world and Jews in Israel understand that, yes, we have a beautiful history, we have great wisdom, collective wisdom in that the forefathers have written and researched, and we have a religion that really was a foundation for many beautiful things in the world, and we should be proud of it and embrace it. And I think that's happening as well. So I'm hopeful for the next, maybe not 6 months, but the little bit more mid-range future will sort out our military challenges, and we will find ourselves stronger, better, happier, more peaceful in the future.
And on that note, Jonathan Conricus, thank you very much for your time, and
Thank you.
you are very welcome in our beautiful country whenever you can get back here.
For having me and for making it possible for me to meet with Australian legislators and to reach out to Australians and speak and share our perspective. Immensely important, and I commend the work of AIJAC.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you.